Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, September 17th, 1959, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev arrived in New York City, where he attended a dinner hosted by the Economic Club of New York. This was a big deal, the Soviet leader on a tour of the United States. There were a number of protests along the way. So let's talk about Khrushchev's visit to the United States, where he did, among other things, give a big speech at the United Nations. Here, as always, is Nicole Hemmer of Columbia. Hello, Nikki.
Hey, Jody.
And I will say, we've been doing this show for a while. We just passed 50, I noticed. We might be closer to 60. But anyway, congratulations. Happy 50th show. Is this our first time talking kind of explicitly about U.S.-Russia Cold War relations?
I think that it is, which is kind of surprising given
Yes.
how large they loomed in the U.S. in this period.
I mean, we missed Bay of Pigs. We missed the fall of the Berlin Wall. Yeah, all right. Well, there's a lot of history out there. Anyway, I'm glad we're talking about it now. And I do want to talk about the big, important stuff here, but I also just kind of want to talk about one of the things that struck me the most about this story, which is just his itinerary. When Khrushchev comes to the United States, I mean, he really, hits all of the spots that you would think you would hit if you're just like, I want to see what the United States is around. He eats a hot dog. He goes to a fair. He goes to California. Does he go to Disneyland? Did I read that correctly?
So he wanted to go to Disneyland. He spends a day sort of hobnobbing with people in Hollywood. He goes behind the scenes at a show that's being put up. But then they'd invited him to Disneyland and said that at the last minute that they couldn't keep him safe. So for security reasons, he couldn't go. And he threw a fit. This man wanted to see Disneyland and was denied, and he was pissed.
Yeah. I mean, you read this itinerary, and missing Disneyland is big. I would be upset too. But it makes you wonder, if I was president, I would say, I really want to improve our relations with, New Zealand, Fiji, Iceland, Argentina. Maybe we should go take some big tours of these places.
Take them to It's a Small World.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's talk about, though, his time in New York. You want to talk about that UN speech? I mean, how big of a deal is it that he's come to the United States and then he's giving a speech at the UN?
So his presence in the U.S. is a huge deal, and we'll talk about all of the different kinds of reactions that it spawned. But given the status of the Cold War and given the tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and just the fact that Soviet premiers did not come to the United States. Coming to the U.S. was a really big deal. And speaking at the UN and giving this speech that was very much pitched as, arms are for hugging, not for war, kind of peacenik speech was a big moment, and it got tons and tons of media attention, as it was always meant to do.
Yeah. So, I mean, does Eisenhower get flack for agreeing to have him come on this visit?
He gets so much flack. So conservatives at the time, led by William F. Buckley Jr. at National Review, see the invitation of Khrushchev as basically a surrender in the Cold War, right? That you're going to have this person who should be being tried at The Hague for war crimes, come to the United States and you're just going to embrace him. They saw this as just utter capitulation. And so they were organizing all kinds of anti-Khrushchev events. They wanted to dye the Hudson River red in honor of the person they called the Bloody Butcher of Budapest. They did the skywriting of crosses in the sky because the Soviet Union was supposed to be this atheistic regime, and so they were going to mark the skies as Christian. They sold black armbands, and then they hold this huge rally at Carnegie Hall to protest Khrushchev's presence.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but it feels like a lot of times when you have bilateral meetings, they're often around a specific agenda item, and this felt more just kind of like diplomatic in the broadest sense of the word, right? To just kind of like try and improve relations. Was there a specific thing on the agenda here, or was it really just like, let's get to know each other a little bit more?
I mean, they were going to have a summit where they would talk about some of the particulars of the U.S.-Soviet relationship, but ultimately the purpose of it was a kind of goodwill tour. So Richard Nixon had gone over to the Soviet Union in July. This was the site of the famous kitchen debate. There had been kind of a cultural exchange between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and this was about kind of thawing the relationship between these two superpowers. Eisenhower was supposed to go over and return the visit later in 1960. That ultimately falls through. Things go bad pretty quickly. But at the moment, it really was about giving peace a chance.
Yeah. And it reminds me a little bit of this idea of just kind of like having the sort of diplomatic level and then the sort of cultural exchange level, and then this feeling like somewhere in between those two. But on the cultural exchange front, I mean, there's such a rich history of that happening between the U.S. and Russia, but then also, I think, a lot of other countries. We watched The War Room pretty recently, and that comes up in The War Room. Bill Clinton took these trips to Russia, and that was obviously in the 70s. But James Carville has that great line when he's asked about Bill Clinton's trip to Russia. Should we be concerned? Is it a sign that he's a secret communist? And he's just like, we were playing basketball with these folks. We were like exchanging, Boy Scouts were going back and forth. Like that's just kind of what people forget that as part of the sort of history. And I will say more in my era, like I think our relationship with a country like Cuba really changed because of cultural exchanges. And once people start to get to know each other's cultures, that often has an effect up on diplomatic relations. And often that happens with sort of at grassroots cultural exchanges, but this feels like a cultural exchange, but happening between two very powerful people, the leaders of the country.
Right. Having Khrushchev there is what makes this such a special and important moment. But I think that your examples are so good, Jody, because they remind us that not only were these cultural exchanges happening, but you always had to worry about the red baiting that was going to happen on the other side, which is even if it was just a basketball game or a baseball game, you'd be accused of making common cause with the Reds, and that being a sign that you were too weak to lead the country in this existential war.
Yeah. So you mentioned how things go really sideways pretty quickly at the end of the 50s. But up until this visit, I mean, this visit does feel like a culmination of, I don't think I want to use the word thawing necessarily, but definitely like Khrushchev, I think, was initially feared to be basically a Stalin clone. And then he does some things throughout the 50s to sort of soften that stance a little bit. And this then feels like a big step. So, I mean, just give us that context of like, was there really hope in Khrushchev and in 1959 for Khrushchev to be the one to really start to improve relations between these two countries?
Yeah, I guess we can save the word détente for the 1970s and 80s. But, it was this moment in the 1950s where Khrushchev, who had promised to bury the United States in the mid-1950s, had come around, at least in terms of his language, to backing away from the arms race. In part, it was a different moment because at that point in time, it seemed like the Soviet Union was winning a lot of the scientific battles. So they had just had landed the first object on the moon.
We should mention that real quickly. There's a great anecdote there. The gift he gives to Eisenhower when he visits the White House is like a little statue of what just landed on the moon the day before, which is such a great little FU kind of gift to give someone.
It's an incredibly passive-aggressive gift. And that, I mean, it's this kind of thing where it's like, haha, we're winning. And there always was this kind of message that was coming out of Khrushchev's mouth and the actual message that he was delivering quivering, and diplomats had to parse those two. And it was very difficult for the U.S. in the late 1950s to say, oh, okay, we'll just press pause on the Cold War. Because again, there was this real sense that there was a missile gap, that there was they were losing the space race, that the U.S. was behind. And to sort of freeze relations where they were was not a good position for the U.S. in a lot of ways.
So let's end here, spinning this forward a little bit. I'm curious kind of whether this visit actually changes anything. And then you can't help but look at a timeline and say, oh my gosh, 3 years later, we have the Bay of Pigs, which is probably considered the low point and the scariest point in the entire history of the Cold War. How do we get from 59 to that moment in just a few years?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. Had the U-2 disaster that happens in 1960 and makes things really, really bad between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, had that not happened, would relations have really thawed? Because it's not just about what was happening in the U.S., it's about the pressures that Khrushchev is facing back home in the Soviet Union to be a tough leader as well. So I'm not going to say that it was all going to be peace and light and harmony, but in May of 1960, when it becomes clear that the U.S. is doing flyovers of the Soviet Union. Anyway, things turn sour pretty quickly. The Soviet Union cancels Eisenhower's trip to the Soviet Union. Khrushchev's language becomes much more antagonistic. And then, as you said, like the Bay of Pigs, the Bay of Pigs in 61, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis in 62. I mean, these are the closest we'd ever come to nuclear war, and they absolutely were some of the scariest moments of the Cold War, and definitely the bottoming out of U.S.-Soviet relations. And both sides really work to try to improve things because they don't actually want to blow up the world with nuclear weapons.
Yes, that's true. One thing you mentioned there, I just want to flag because I think about it all the time, but it's, the pressures that he was feeling at home dictating his actions. And I think that that's just so important. Like when you read about the history of the Cold War, like so often it's really about what was happening inside Russia or inside the United States. And even now, right, you read about North Korea, and almost always the answer comes from someone who really knows that country and knows about the developments the previous week in North Korea, and that's what someone's responding to. And I suppose people who look at our country and our leader these days probably would be better off having an understanding of what's going on in this country too. It just feels like the behavior is almost always dictated by domestic concerns more than anything.
Leaders are almost always playing to domestic audiences because it's domestic audiences that hold them to account.
In power, yeah.
So it's a really important note.
Yeah. Let's do a few of these also on this days. We haven't done this in a little bit, and there's some interesting ones. I'll rattle them off. You tell me if there's anything that catches your eye. The Constitution was completed and signed on this day in 1787. Good for them.
Seems like a big moment.
Nice work. This is it's the weather is turning, but you read the stories of the signing of the Constitution. It was very, very hot in that room, so they were probably eager to get out of there. 1849, Harriet Tubman escaped slavery in Maryland with two of her brothers. And
then returns to the South again and again to help other enslaved people find freedom, which is pretty amazing.
Yep. 1862, Antietam, the Battle of Antietam ends. That's the bloodiest battle in the Civil War. 23,000 people killed, wounded, or captured. And then in 2011, this has come up a few times, but we should mention this. Occupy Wall Street first started in New York in 2011, and I will continue to maintain that Occupy Wall Street is one of the big strains in our modern political life that maybe doesn't get enough credit for setting off whatever we want to call this era we're living in.
100% cosign.
Yeah. Okay, let's leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX. Our researcher is Jacob Feldman. He is a producer for the show along with Brittany Brown. Follow us on social media at This Day Pod. Leave a rating or review wherever you get your podcast. They really do help others discover the show, so leave a rating if you can on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. Thanks again to everyone who's been reaching out with comments and suggestions. That address is thisdaypod@gmail.com. There is also a contact form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Abergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
The United Nations came right into the picture when Mr. Khrushchev visited New York. Outside the building, the sort of protest that Mr. Khrushchev must certainly have expected were being paraded. Don't know whether he saw much of them, but they certainly spoke eloquently for those people who don't really care for Mr. K.
Radiotopia.